They came to my door in the dead of night, badges flashing, voices cold, demanding I step outside. My heart pounded as neighbors peeked through their blinds, whispering about what crime I could have possibly committed. But something about these officers felt wrong. Their uniforms didn't fit. Their stories didn't match. And the strangest part? They weren't sent by the city at all. They were sent by my own homeowners association. That's right. The same board that fines people for weeds in their yard was now pretending to have the power to arrest me. But what they didn't know was that I wasn't just any resident. I was the one person they should have never crossed. At first glance, life in my neighborhood seemed perfect. Quiet, tree-lined streets. Kids riding their bikes until the sun went down. Neighbors waving as they watered their lawns. It was the kind of place people dreamed of settling into. Clean, safe, and welcoming. My wife and I had chosen this community because it promised peace after years of chaos in the city. We wanted stability, a home where our kids could grow up without constant noise or danger. And, for a while, that's exactly what we got. I spent my days working long hours, serving the very community I lived in, though few of my neighbors knew exactly what I did for a living. To most of them, I was just another homeowner, mowing the grass on weekends, putting up lights during the holidays, and sitting out on the porch when the evenings were cool. Our home wasn't the biggest on the block, but it was ours. We had poured years of savings into making it comfortable, and it truly felt like the beginning of a better life. But beneath the postcard-perfect exterior of our neighborhood, something was always brewing. It started with the subtle things. Notes tucked under windshields about trash cans being left out too long, complaints about flower beds not being uniform enough, and whispers of certain board members who seemed to enjoy flexing their authority more than maintaining harmony. The Homeowners Association, or HOA as everyone called it, wasn't just enforcing rules. It was hunting for ways to remind people who was really in charge. At first, I brushed it off. After all, every community had its quirks, and every board had its politics. But slowly, their presence began creeping into daily life. Notices for minor infractions started landing in mailboxes more frequently. People who once waved across the street began to keep their heads down, wary of drawing unwanted attention. The atmosphere of warmth was slowly being replaced with one of control and quiet fear. And then, inevitably, the board turned its attention to me. The first sign that the HOA had decided to make me their target came in the form of a letter. It was neatly folded, tucked into an envelope that bore their official logo, and delivered right to my door. Inside was a notice that my mailbox, yes, my mailbox, was non-compliant. They claimed the shade of paint was slightly off from the neighborhood standard. I stood there on my porch, rereading the letter, trying to decide if this was some kind of joke. Our mailbox had been there since the day we moved in, untouched, unbothered, and perfectly fine. But apparently, someone on the board had decided that this small, harmless detail was worth a formal warning. At first, I shrugged it off. I had seen neighbors get notices like this before. For garden gnomes, for curtains in the wrong color, even for leaving a recycling bin visible for a few extra hours. It was ridiculous, sure, but not worth losing sleep over. I figured if I ignored it, they'd move on to the next target. But I was wrong. Ignoring them was the worst thing I could have done. 2 weeks later, another letter arrived. This time, it was a fine. $50 for failure to correct non-compliant property feature. $50 over the color of a mailbox. I could almost hear the smug satisfaction of the board member who'd written it. Still, $50 wasn't going to break me. And again, I let it go. But the fines didn't stop there. Soon, they were coming like clockwork. $100 for grass not properly edged. Another $100 for vehicle parked at an improper angle. The rules they cited were vague, twisted, and often flat-out wrong. But that didn't matter. The fines kept piling up, and with each one, it became clearer that this wasn't about rules at all. This was personal. Neighbors began to notice too. I'd catch them glancing at me as they checked their mailboxes, some whispering as I walked past. A few even warned me quietly to be careful. "Once they've got you in their sights," one older man told me, "they won't let up until they get what they want." When I asked what that was, he just shook his head. Control. Always control. The more I resisted, the bolder the HOA became. They started sending so-called inspectors by my house. These weren't professionals, just board members in polos and clipboards, strolling past my yard, snapping photos, and scribbling notes. Sometimes, they didn't even bother pretending to be discreet. One afternoon, I looked out my window to see two of them standing on my lawn, measuring tape stretched across my driveway. When I confronted them, they simply said, "Just routine compliance checks," and walked away with smug smiles. My frustration turned to anger when the HOA escalated beyond petty fines. They began threatening legal action, claiming they had the authority to place liens on my property if I didn't pay up. It was extortion dressed up in formal language, and they sent these threats with the confidence of people who thought no one would ever challenge them. And maybe that was true for most homeowners, but not for me. Still, I played along, biding my time. I documented every notice, every photo, every petty violation they sent my way. I wasn't about to let them drag me into court unprepared, but as the pressure grew, so did their desperation. The breaking point came when I received a letter unlike the others. This one wasn't a fine, it was a summons. According to the HOA, I was required to appear before a disciplinary hearing for continued non-compliance. They scheduled it for a weekday morning, deliberately during working hours, and claimed failure to attend would be considered an admission of guilt. The arrogance was staggering. They weren't content with draining money. They wanted to humiliate me, to parade me in front of the board like some criminal. When I showed up, the atmosphere was suffocating. The board members sat in a row, papers stacked high, acting as if they were judges in a courtroom. One of them began reading off a list of supposed violations, everything from grass height to unapproved holiday decorations. They spoke in rehearsed tones, their eyes gleaming with a satisfaction that told me this wasn't about rules. It was about breaking me. But I didn't flinch. I sat through their charade, silently noting every absurd claim, every fabricated violation. When they were done, they announced that I owed nearly $3,000 in accumulated fines. $3,000 over a mailbox, some grass, and a few decorations. And then, as if that wasn't enough, they gave me an ultimatum. Pay up within 30 days or face further enforcement measures. I left that room furious, but I also left with clarity. This was no longer just harassment. This was an abuse of power, and they weren't going to stop. What I didn't realize at the time was how far they'd be willing to go to enforce their threats. The harassment escalated beyond paper. Strange vehicles began parking outside my home late at night, idling with their headlights off. Anonymous notes were left on my car windshield, warning me to cooperate if I knew what was good for me. My wife grew nervous, jumping at every sound, pulling the curtains tighter every evening. My children started asking why people were taking pictures of our house. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules anymore. They were waging psychological warfare. And then came the night that changed everything. It started with a pounding at the door, heavy fists striking wood, loud enough to wake the entire block. When I opened it, two men stood there in dark uniforms, badges glinting in the porch light. "Sir, you're under arrest," one of them said flatly. My stomach dropped, even though I knew I hadn't committed any crime. My mind raced. Was this real? Were they actually police officers? But something was off. Their uniforms didn't match. Their equipment looked cheap, almost like costumes. And when I asked to see paperwork, their confidence cracked. That's when the horrifying truth clicked into place. These weren't real officers. They were imposters, sent unbelievably by my own HOA. That was the moment I realized just how dangerous my situation had become. The HOA wasn't playing games anymore. They were trying to destroy me. But what they didn't know was that they had made a fatal mistake. Because if there's one person you should never send fake cops after, it's the real chief of police. The two imposters stood on my porch, their makeshift badges catching the dim glow of the streetlight. Neighbors' blinds shifted as curious eyes peered out, wondering why a supposed arrest was unfolding on our quiet street. The men repeated their demand for me to step outside, their voices firmer now, more threatening, as if volume could make up for authenticity. But I didn't move. I studied every detail, the ill-fitting uniforms, the cheap handcuffs clipped to their belts, the way their boots didn't match standard issue. These weren't police officers. They weren't deputies. They weren't anything except pawns in a dangerous game. And behind them, I saw the shadows of the HOA board members lurking at a safe distance, watching the spectacle they thought would finally break me. For a brief moment, I let the scene play out. I wanted them to believe I was rattled, that their intimidation was working. My wife whispered anxiously from behind the door, begging me to let it go, but I shook my head. This had gone far beyond fines and notices. This was a crime, and they had no idea they had just walked straight into a trap. Calmly, I asked for their identification again. One of the men pulled a laminated card from his pocket, the kind you could print at a local copy shop. I held it in my hand, tilted it under the porch light, and felt a surge of controlled anger rise in my chest. It was fake, laughably fake. And that's when I let them know. "You boys just made the biggest mistake of your lives," I said evenly. "Because you're standing on the porch of the chief of police." Their faces drained of color. The smug confidence evaporated instantly, replaced by nervous glances at each other. They stammered excuses, insisting this was a misunderstanding. But it was too late. I stepped back inside my house, grabbed my radio, and within minutes, real squad cars were pulling into the neighborhood, lights flashing red and blue against the walls of every home. The night went from staged intimidation to absolute chaos. Neighbors spilled onto their lawns, recording with their phones, whispering in shock as the truth unfolded. The imposters were detained on the spot, cuffed with real steel this time, their cheap uniforms confiscated as evidence. The HOA board members who had orchestrated the stunt tried to slip away into the darkness, but they didn't make it far. Officers intercepted them at the corner, escorting them back under the glow of flashing lights. I watched silently as the ringleaders of the HOA were questioned in front of everyone. Their power, their arrogance, their smug dominance of the community, all of it crumbled in a single night. The same neighbors they had bullied for years now stood watching, some with smirks of satisfaction, others shaking their heads in disbelief. It was poetic justice, playing out live on our very own street. The board members denied everything at first, swearing they had no knowledge of the imposters. But evidence told a different story. The fake officers confessed almost immediately, admitting they had been promised compensation, by certain individuals on the HOA board if they could scare me into compliance. The lies unraveled faster than anyone expected, and the humiliation was complete. Still, I wasn't finished. This wasn't just about embarrassment. This was about accountability. The following days turned into a whirlwind. My department launched a full investigation, treating the case with the seriousness it deserved. Forged IDs, impersonation of law enforcement, conspiracy, harassment. The list of charges piled higher and higher. And for the first time, the HOA board members realized that they weren't untouchable. Their petty fines and self-written rules had always been a weapon, but now they were facing real consequences alone. The peak moment came during a public hearing that drew nearly every resident in the neighborhood. The room buzzed with anticipation as evidence was laid out. Photographs of the imposters, statements from the men themselves, and a stack of HOA communications that tied the board directly to the plan. Residents who had once sat quietly through board meetings now sat with arms crossed, glaring at the very people who had made their lives miserable. As I testified, I made sure to speak not just for myself, but for every homeowner who had endured their harassment. I described the endless fines, the intimidation tactics, the culture of fear they had built in a place that was supposed to be home. And then, I revealed the moment they crossed the line, sending fake officers to my door, an act so reckless and dangerous it could have spiraled into violence. The gasp that rippled through the room was deafening. The board members sat pale and speechless, their reputations shredded in front of the very people they once ruled over. The HOA president tried to interject, claiming I was exaggerating, but the evidence was overwhelming. When the video footage from neighbors' phones was played, showing the imposters demanding my arrest, showing the real police arriving moments later, any remaining doubt was obliterated. For years, they had thrived on secrecy, using fear to keep residents compliant. But now, everything was out in the open. Their power, their credibility, their very authority had been annihilated in the most public way possible. And the neighbors, who once kept their heads down, now erupted into quiet applause as the truth settled in. Standing in that room, watching the HOA's empire of pettiness collapse, I felt a mix of vindication and sadness. Vindication, because justice was finally catching up to them. Sadness, because it never should have come to this. These were supposed to be neighbors, people entrusted to make life better for the community. Instead, they had become tyrants, and in their arrogance, they had destroyed themselves. But the most powerful moment came at the end of the hearing. The lead investigator announced that multiple board members were being referred for criminal charges. Gasps and murmurs filled the room as the reality sank in. The people who had once wielded fines and threats were now facing potential jail time. And in that moment, I realized something important. This wasn't just the end of my battle with the HOA. This was a turning point for the entire community. When the gavel finally struck, echoing through the crowded hearing room, it felt like the sound of a chapter slamming shut. For months, the HOA board had ruled the community through intimidation, fines, and arrogance. But now, in front of neighbors, police officers, and investigators, their reign had collapsed in spectacular fashion. The board members who once barked orders and signed off on fabricated violations now shuffled in silence, pale and trembling, escorted out under the watchful eyes of real law enforcement. The same people who fined families for leaving a trash can out too long were now facing criminal charges that carried the weight of prison time. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. At first, the neighborhood buzzed with disbelief. People stood in clusters, whispering, shaking their heads, trying to process the scale of what had just happened. For years, many had assumed the HOA's power was absolute, unquestionable, that resisting them was futile. But now, with the curtain pulled back and the truth exposed, the spell had been broken. In the days that followed, the community changed almost overnight. The once feared notices stopped arriving. The inspectors with their clipboards and smug smiles vanished. The intimidation that had hung like a cloud over every street evaporated. For the first time in years, people walked their dogs without glancing over their shoulders, parked their cars without worrying about improper angles, and decorated their homes without fear of fines. A new sense of freedom settled in, one that had been stolen from us for too long. But while the relief was palpable, the scars of what had happened ran deep. Families who had quietly paid thousands in unjust fines now realized they had been victims of systemic abuse. Elderly residents, who had once been too afraid to even question the board, came forward with stories of threats and harassment that they had endured in silence. The floodgates had opened, and suddenly, the HOA's dark history spilled into the light. Class action lawsuits began forming almost immediately. Attorneys lined up to represent residents who had suffered at the hands of the corrupt board. What had once been dismissed as just HOA politics was now recognized as coordinated harassment, abuse of power, and, in some cases, outright fraud. The legal fallout promised to stretch for months, if not years. But for most of us, it wasn't about the money. It was about justice, about making sure no one would ever again hold unchecked power over our community. As for me, I became something of an unlikely symbol in the neighborhood. People I had barely spoken to before now approached me with gratitude, shaking my hand, thanking me for standing up to the HOA when no one else dared.